I'm Sarah Michelle, 29, and 3 months ago I lost my husband Marcus in Hurricane Katrina's aftermath, while he was volunteering with the Coast Guard rescue operations, while I was still sleeping in his t-shirts and crying over his coffee mug. My mother-in-law Patricia told me at his memorial service that my excessive drama was embarrassing the family. She said I needed to move on like a proper widow and stop making everything about me. What she didn't know was that Marcus had left me a letter to open exactly 90 days after his death. His death hand? What I found inside would expose the real reason. They wanted me to disappear so quickly. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Like this video if you've ever had your grief questioned, because what happens next will shock you. 3 months earlier, Hurricane Katrina was bearing down on New Orleans like nothing we'd ever seen. The news kept showing those satellite images, this massive, swirling monster heading straight for us. Marcus had been pacing around our little shotgun house in the Garden District for 2 days, constantly checking his phone and watching the weather reports. "Baby, you need to evacuate," he kept telling me, his Coast Guard training kicking in. "This one's different. This one's going to be bad." But Marcus wasn't leaving. He'd volunteered for emergency rescue operations, and nothing I said could change his mind. I remember standing in our kitchen that Sunday morning, August 28th, watching him pack his gear. His hands were steady as he folded his extra uniform, but I could see the worry in his dark brown eyes. "Sarah, listen to me," he said, stopping what he was doing to pull me close. "I need you to go to your sister's in Houston. Take the important papers from the filing cabinet. You know which ones, and baby," he kissed my forehead, "there's something in my desk drawer, a small envelope. If anything happens to me, don't open it right away. Wait, exactly 90 days. Can you promise me that?" I laughed nervously. "Nothing's going to happen to you, Marcus. You're going to come home, and we're going to rebuild whatever this storm breaks." But he made me promise anyway. That was Marcus, always thinking 3 steps ahead. Always protecting me even when I didn't know I needed protecting. The last time I saw my husband alive, he was standing in our doorway in his Coast Guard rescue gear, that familiar, confident smile on his face. "I love you, Sarah Michelle Rodriguez," he said, using my full married name the way he did when he was being serious. "More than you'll ever know." I drove to Houston that night, but I couldn't stay away. The next morning, Tuesday, August 30th, I was glued to the news coverage, watching the levees break and the water rise. Marcus had texted me once, rescuing families from rooftops. "I love you. Keep the papers safe." That was the last message I ever received from him. On Wednesday morning, my phone rang. It was Captain Morrison from Marcus's unit. His voice was gentle but firm. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I need you to sit down." The building collapse happened during what should have been a routine rescue. Marcus and 2 other guardsmen were evacuating an elderly couple from their flooded apartment when the structure gave way. The couple survived. Marcus and Petty Officer Jenkins didn't. I don't remember much about the drive back to New Orleans 2 weeks later. The city looked like a war zone, debris everywhere, houses with those haunting spray-painted X's marking who had been found and who hadn't. Our little house had 3 feet of water damage, but it was still standing, unlike my world, which had completely shattered. But that voicemail, I found it when I finally turned on Marcus's phone, which had been recovered with his personal effects. It was time-stamped at 6:47 a.m. on August 30th, just before his final rescue mission. "Hey baby, it's me. If you're hearing this, then, well, things didn't go the way we planned. I love you so much, Sarah. You're stronger than you know, and you're going to need that strength. Remember what I told you about the papers? About waiting 90 days? There are things about my family, about our finances, that I should have told you sooner. I was trying to protect you, but now I realize that might have been wrong. The papers will explain everything. Trust no one but yourself, baby. Not even my family. I love you." That voicemail saved my sanity during those first dark weeks, but it also planted a seed of something else. Suspicion. The memorial service was held 3 months after Marcus died. On a gray November morning that felt as heavy as my heart. We'd waited this long because the Coast Guard wanted to complete their investigation, and because, honestly, I wasn't ready to say goodbye. I'd been living in this strange bubble of grief, wearing Marcus's old LSU t-shirts and sleeping on his side of the bed, still expecting him to walk through the door. St. Augustine Catholic Church was packed. Marcus had touched so many lives during his 6 years with the Coast Guard, and the entire community had rallied around his sacrifice. I sat in the front pew, clutching the folded American flag that had covered his empty casket. They never recovered his body, trying to hold myself together as person after person shared stories about my husband's courage and kindness. But Patricia Rodriguez had other plans for the day. Marcus's mother had always been a formidable woman. At 58, she carried herself with the authority of someone who'd raised 3 children as a single mother after her husband died young. She had steel gray hair that she wore in a perfect bun, and eyes that could cut glass when she was displeased. Today, she was very displeased. "Sarah, dear," she said, approaching me during the reception at the church hall. Her voice was sweet, but her eyes were cold. "We need to talk about your display today." I looked up from where I was sitting, still holding Marcus's flag. "I'm sorry, what? The crying, the dramatics? It's been 3 months, honey. People are starting to talk?" She glanced around the room where Marcus's Coast Guard colleagues were sharing stories and supporting each other. "This excessive grief isn't healthy. Marcus wouldn't want you carrying on like this." I felt like she'd slapped me. "Excessive grief, Patricia. I lost my husband." "We all lost Marcus," she said sharply. "But some of us are handling it with dignity. You're embarrassing the family with all this emotion. It's time to move on like a proper widow." David, Marcus's younger brother, appeared at Patricia's shoulder. At 26, he looked so much like Marcus that seeing him sometimes took my breath away. But where Marcus had been warm and protective, David was distant and calculating. "Mom's right, Sarah," he said quietly. "Maybe it's time to think about what Marcus would really want. He'd want his family to be strong, to take care of business." "Take care of business." I stood up, the flag clutched against my chest. "What business?" Patricia's eyes narrowed. "There are practical matters to discuss. The house, Marcus's things, his arrangements. You can't just keep everything in limbo forever." That's when I noticed Jennifer, Marcus's sister, standing nearby. She was 2 years older than Marcus, a real estate agent with perfectly styled blonde hair and a designer dress that probably cost more than I made in a month. She wouldn't meet my eyes. "What arrangements?" I asked, my voice getting stronger. "Marcus was my husband. Everything he owned is mine." "Is it?" Patricia's voice was silk over steel. "Are you sure about that, dear? Marcus was very private about his finances. There might be things you don't know." The church hall seemed to go quiet around us, though I know people were still talking. I felt like I was in a fishbowl, everyone watching this woman attack me at my own husband's memorial service. "I think you need to step back, Patricia," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "This is not the time or place." "Oh, but it is," she replied. "Because you're making everything about you, Sarah. Your grief, your pain, your loss. What about the rest of us? What about Marcus's real family?" The words hit me like a physical blow. Real family. As if 3 years of marriage, of building a life together, of loving her son with everything I had, meant nothing. I looked around the room and saw the Coast Guard flag ceremony beginning. Marcus's commanding officer was preparing to present me with the ceremonial flag, the one that should be mine as his widow, but Patricia stepped forward. "That should go to his mother," she announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I raised him. I deserve to have something to remember him by." The officer looked confused, glancing between Patricia and me. "Ma'am, protocol dictates that the flag goes to the spouse. She's not really family," Patricia interrupted. 3 years of marriage doesn't compare to 32 years of being his mother. The room had gone completely silent now. I could feel every eye on us, watching this woman try to humiliate me at my husband's memorial. My hands were shaking as I stood there holding Marcus's first flag, watching his mother try to take the second one. But something inside me, maybe it was Marcus's voice from that voicemail. Maybe it was just 3 months of pent-up rage finally snapped. "No," I said, my voice carrying across the silent room. "That flag is mine. Marcus was my husband, my partner, my life. And if you think I'm going to stand here and let you disrespect his memory and our marriage, you're wrong." I walked up to the officer and accepted the second flag. Patricia's face was purple with fury, but she couldn't make a scene in front of the entire Coast Guard unit and half of New Orleans. As I left the church that day, carrying both flags, I heard Patricia's voice behind me. "This isn't over, Sarah. There are things you don't know. Things Marcus kept from you. And when the truth comes out, you'll understand why I tried to spare you this embarrassment." Her words followed me home, echoing in my head as I sat in our empty house, surrounded by Marcus's things and the growing certainty that his family was hiding something important. Something that Marcus had tried to protect me from, but had ultimately decided I needed to know. 90 days? I just had to wait 90 days, and then I'd understand everything. 1 week after the memorial service, Patricia called me with that deceptively sweet voice she used when she wanted something. "Sarah, dear, we need to have a family meeting. There are some things we need to discuss about Marcus's affairs. Can you come to my house Sunday afternoon?" I almost said no. The confrontation at the memorial had left me raw and angry, and I wasn't ready to face Patricia's criticism again. But something in her tone made me curious. Maybe it was the way she said Marcus's affairs, like she knew something. IDN. Single quotes T. Patricia lived in a beautiful Creole cottage in the French Quarter that had been in the Rodriguez family for 3 generations. It was the kind of house that tourists photographed: trot iron balconies, ancient brick walls, and interior courtyards that whispered of old New Orleans money. I'd always felt intimidated by it, by the weight of family history that seemed to press down on me whenever I visited. When I arrived that Sunday, David and Jennifer were already there, sitting in the formal living room like they were attending a board meeting. Patricia had coffee and beignets laid out on the antique mahogany table, but the atmosphere was anything but welcoming. "Sarah, thank you for coming," Patricia said, gesturing to the chair across from her. It felt like being called to the principal's office. "We need to discuss some practical matters now that we've honored Marcus's memory." Jennifer shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She'd been avoiding my eyes since I arrived, which wasn't like her. Before Marcus died, Jennifer and I had gotten along well. We'd gone shopping together, shared girl talk over wine. Now she looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. "What practical matters?" I asked, accepting the coffee but not touching the food. My stomach was too knotted with anxiety to eat. "Well," Patricia began, pulling out a manila folder, "there's the matter of Marcus's personal effects. Some of these items have been in the Rodriguez family for generations. They should stay in the family." She opened the folder and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside were 3 rings: Marcus's wedding band, his father's class ring from Tulane, and a signet ring with the Rodriguez family crest. "These belonged to his father and his grandfather," Patricia continued. "They're family heirlooms. They should be passed down to David, not kept by—" She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear: not kept by an outsider. I stared at the rings, especially Marcus's wedding band. I'd been wearing it on a chain around my neck since the day he died. It was the only thing that made me feel close to him anymore. "That's my husband's wedding ring," I said quietly. "It belongs with me, does it?" David spoke up for the first time. "I mean, Sarah, no offense, but you and Marcus were only married for 3 years. These rings represent generations of Rodriguez men. They should stay in the family name." "I am family," I said, my voice getting stronger. "I was Marcus's wife," where Patricia emphasized. "Past tense. You're a widow now, dear." "That's different." The way she said widow made it sound like a disease, something shameful that I needed to get over as quickly as possible. Jennifer finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe we could compromise. Maybe Sarah could keep the wedding ring, but the family rings could come back to us." Patricia shot her a sharp look. "Jennifer, we discussed this. All the rings stay in the family. Sarah has plenty of other things to remember Marcus by." "Like what?" I asked. "His clothes? His books? The furniture we bought together?" I could feel my anger building. Patricia, Marcus chose to marry me. He'd talked him. Chose to build a life with me. These rings are part of that life. Marcus made a lot of choices in his final years that weren't necessarily wise, Patricia said carefully. "The point is, we need to think about what's best for everyone involved." That's when David dropped the real bomb. "Sarah, there's something else we need to discuss. The house." My blood went cold. "What about the house?" "Well, Marcus owned several properties," David said, glancing at his mother. "The house you're living in, plus some rental properties around the city. But the ownership situation is ... complicated." "Complicated how?" I could barely get the words out. Patricia leaned forward. "Marcus took out a second mortgage on your house last year, a large one. He needed the money for some investments that didn't pan out. The payments are ... substantial." I felt like the floor was falling out from under me. "That's impossible. I would have had to sign for a second mortgage. Louisiana is a community property state." "Not if the property was owned before the marriage," Jennifer said quietly. "Not if there were other arrangements." "What other arrangements?" I demanded. The 3 of them exchanged looks. Patricia sighed dramatically. "Sarah, I didn't want to have to tell you this, but Marcus bought that house before you were married. He never added your name to the deed. Legally, it was his separate property." The room started spinning. The house where Marcus and I had planned to raise our children, where we'd painted the nursery last spring before I miscarried, where every corner held memories of our life together. It wasn't even mine. "But we lived there together," I said. "Weekly we renovated it together. We made it our home." "Yes, and I'm sorry about that," Patricia said, though she didn't look sorry at all. "But legally, the house belongs to Marcus's estate, which means it belongs to his family." "I'm his family," I repeated, but my voice was small now. "His blood family," David corrected. "Look, Sarah, we're not trying to be cruel here. But Marcus left behind some financial obligations that need to be handled. The rental properties are generating income, but there are also debts, significant debts. I looked around the room at these three people who had welcomed me into their family when Marcus and I got engaged, who had included me in holidays and celebrations, who had called me daughter and sister. Now they were sitting here calmly dismantling my entire life. "What are you saying?" I asked. "We're saying that it might be easier for everyone if you started thinking about other living arrangements," Patricia said gently. "The house payments are quite high, and with Marcus gone, well, can you really afford to keep it?" I stood up abruptly, the coffee cup rattling against the saucer. "You're trying to take my home?" "We're trying to be practical," Patricia said. "You're a young woman, Sarah. You can start over somewhere else, build a new life. But this house, these properties, they're part of the Rodriguez legacy. They need to stay in the family." "I need to go," I said, grabbing my purse. "I need to think about this." "Of course," Patricia said, standing as well. "But don't think too long, dear. There are bills to pay and time is money." As I walked toward the door, David called after me. "Sarah, we really are trying to help you here. Marcus wouldn't want you to be burdened with all this financial stress. He'd want you to be free to move on." I turned back to look at him. "You don't know what Marcus would want. None of you do." But as I drove home through the quarter, past the tourists and the street musicians and the normal life that seemed to be happening everywhere except in my world, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe they were right. Maybe there were things about Marcus's finances that I didn't know. Maybe there were things about my marriage that I didn't know. The thought terrified me more than losing the house. After the family meeting, Patricia's pressure intensified. She called every other day with suggestions about what I should do with Marcus's belongings, always with that sweet voice that barely concealed her impatience. David started showing up unannounced to check on me and ask pointed questions about the house's maintenance and my plans for the future. By the third week of November, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to box up Marcus's clothes and personal items, not because I was ready to let them go, but because I needed to feel like I was making some kind of progress. Maybe if I showed the family that I was dealing with things, they'd back off and give me space to grieve. I started with his dresser in our bedroom. Each drawer was like opening a time capsule: his Coast Guard dog tags, ticket stubs from our first date, the lucky penny he'd carried since high school. I was trying not to cry as I folded his uniform, shirts when I decided to move the heavy dresser to vacuum underneath it. Marcus had always been particular about keeping the bedroom clean, and I hadn't touched that area since before Katrina. That's when I found it taped to the underside of the dresser's bottom drawer was a small key, the kind that opens a safety deposit box. With it was a piece of paper in Marcus's handwriting. "For Sarah only. Wait exactly 90 days from August 30th. Trust no one. The truth will set you free, but first it will break your heart." I sat on our bedroom floor, holding that key and staring at the note until my hands stopped shaking. August 30th was the day Marcus died. 90 days from then would be November 28th, just 1 week away. Suddenly, everything started making sense in the most terrifying way possible. Marcus's mysterious phone calls in the weeks before Katrina, the way he'd been secretive about his laptop, closing it whenever I came into the room, his insistence that I take the important papers with me when I evacuated, papers that I'd grabbed randomly from our filing cabinet and never really examined, and most disturbing of all, the way his family had been acting since the memorial service. The sudden urgency about his belongings, the questions about the house, the way they kept mentioning things about Marcus's finances that I didn't know. What if they knew something? What if Marcus had discovered something about his family that made him hide evidence, just in case? I got up and went to Marcus's desk in our home office. He'd been so organized, everything in its place, but now I was looking at it with different eyes. I'd been through his papers before, of course, but only to find immediate necessities: insurance policies, bank statements, the basic information I needed to handle his estate. Now I started really looking. His laptop was password protected, which I'd expected. But tucked in the back of his desk drawer, I found a small notebook with columns of numbers and dates. At first glance, it looked like financial records, but the handwriting was rushed, almost frantic. The entries went back about 6 months before his death. Mom, $5,000 emergency. David, $2,500 investment opportunity, property taxes $8,000 behind since 2003. Jennifer, $1,200 car repair. The list went on for pages. Thousands and thousands of dollars, all flowing from Marcus to his family members. Money I'd never known about. Expenses I'd never seen reflected in our joint checking account. At the bottom of the last page, in Marcus's neat handwriting, was a total that made me gasp. $47,000 in family support for just that year alone. Below that, he'd written, "How did I not see this pattern before? Sarah doesn't know. What else don't I know? I sat back in his chair, my mind reeling. $47,000 in 1 year. That was more than I made in my entire salary as a teacher. Where had Marcus gotten that kind of money, and why had he hidden it from me? I started going through our bank statements more carefully, looking for large withdrawals or transfers that I'd missed before. Most of our finances had been joint, but Marcus had maintained one checking account from before our marriage that he used for business expenses. I'd never paid much attention to it because he'd always handled the bills and told me everything was fine. But now, looking at the statements, I could see a pattern. Large deposits from sources I didn't recognize, followed by withdrawals that matched the amounts in Marcus's notebook. It was like he'd been running a family bank, funding everyone's emergencies and investments without ever telling me. But where was the money coming from? I thought about Patricia's house in the French Quarter, about Jennifer's designer clothes and new car, about David's casual attitude toward money despite working only part-time as a bartender. I thought about their assumption that they could just claim Marcus's property, their knowledge of mortgages and debts that I'd never heard of. What if Marcus hadn't been supporting his family out of generosity? What if they'd been taking money from him and he'd finally figured it out? The notebook was dated up until 2 weeks before Katrina hit. The last entry was different from the others. In Marcus's careful handwriting, it read, "Meeting with lawyer tomorrow. Need to document everything before I confront them. If something happens to me, Sarah needs to know the truth." My hands were shaking as I read those words. Marcus had known something was wrong. He'd been investigating his own family, and he'd been protecting me from whatever he'd discovered. I looked at the calendar on his desk. November 28th was circled in red ink, with 90 days written underneath. He'd calculated it exactly, knowing that it would take me this long to get through the initial shock and grief, to be ready to handle whatever truth he'd uncovered. But that meant he'd also known that his family would start pressuring me. He'd known they would come after the house, the properties, the money. He'd planned for this 7 more days. I just had to wait 7 more days and then I'd know everything. But looking at that notebook, at the evidence of secrets and lies that went back years, I realized that Marcus had been right about one thing. The truth was going to break my heart. Before it set me free, I carefully put everything back where I'd found it, but I kept the key. Whatever Marcus had hidden away, whatever he'd wanted me to find, it was going to change everything. And based on the way his family had been acting, I had a feeling they knew it too. They weren't just grieving Marcus's death. They were afraid of what his death might reveal. The week after I found Marcus's notebook, Patricia's calls became daily occurrences. Each conversation felt like water, torture, constant, persistent, designed to wear me down until I gave in to whatever she wanted. "Sarah, honey, I've been thinking about your situation," she said during Tuesday's call. "The house payments must be overwhelming for you on a teacher's salary. Have you considered what you're going to do?" I was grading papers at my kitchen table, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy by returning to work part-time. The familiar routine of red ink and lesson plans was one of the few things keeping me sane. "I'm managing fine, Patricia," I said, though honestly I wasn't sure that was true. Marcus had always handled our finances, and I was still piecing together exactly what our monthly expenses were. "Are you really, though?" Her voice carried that tone of false concern that I was learning to recognize because David mentioned that he saw some medical bills on Marcus's desk when he was helping you move boxes. Bills that looked ... significant. My pen stopped moving across the paper I was grading. "What medical bills?" "Oh, didn't you know?" Patricia's surprise sounded rehearsed. "Marcus was seeing a specialist last spring. Nothing serious, of course, but you know how expensive these things can get without proper insurance coverage." A cold dread settled in my stomach. What kind of specialist? A cardiologist? Dr. Melanchon on Magazine Street? Apparently, Marcus had been having some chest pains, some irregularities that concerned his regular doctor. He didn't want to worry you, especially after ... double quotes. She paused delicately. "Well, after you lost the baby in March, he thought you had enough stress." The world tilted sideways. Marcus had seen a heart doctor, had chest pains, and I knew nothing about it. "How do you know all this?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "Well, the bills came to his mother's address. Naturally, that's been his permanent address for insurance purposes since he was 18. I thought you knew that." "I didn't know that. I didn't know any of it." "Patricia, I need to see those bills." "Of course, dear. David can bring them by this evening." "But Sarah, I have to warn you, they're substantial. Over $12,000, and that's just for the initial testing. If Marcus needed ongoing treatment," she let the implication hang in the air. "If Marcus had lived, if he'd needed expensive cardiac care, how would we have paid for it? My teacher's salary certainly wouldn't have covered specialized medical treatment." David showed up at my door. That evening, with a manila envelope and his familiar apologetic expression, "I'm sorry you have to see these," he said, handing me the stack of bills. "We should have told you sooner, but with everything else going on," I spread the papers across my kitchen table. Bill after bill from Dr. Malankin's office, the Heart Institute, various testing facilities, echocardiograms, stress tests, cardiac catheterization. The dates spanned from February through July, 5 months of medical care that Marcus had hidden from me completely. He was scared, David said quietly, sitting across from me. Scared about his heart. Scared about the money. Scared about telling you. You know how Marcus was, he wanted to protect everyone? The total amount made my hands shake. $15,437, all marked past due in red stamping. But his insurance, I started. Coast Guard insurance covered some of it, but there were gaps. Pre-existing condition clauses, experimental procedures that weren't fully approved. Marcus was trying to handle it on his own. I thought about the notebook upstairs. About the $47,000 Marcus had given his family in just 1 year. While he was struggling to pay for his own medical care, he was funding everyone else's emergencies and investments. David, how did Marcus afford to give your family so much money if he couldn't even pay his own medical bills? David's face went carefully blank. What do you mean? I found his records. Thousands of dollars to your mother, to you, to Jennifer. Where was that money coming from? Sarah, I think you might be confused about. I'm not confused. I pulled out one of the bank statements I'd been reviewing. Look at this. $5,000 withdrawn the same week these heart tests were done. Money that went to your mother for some emergency while my husband couldn't pay his own doctor bills? David stood up abruptly. Look, Marcus made his own choices about how to spend his money. If he chose to help his family, that was between him and us. Help his family. I was standing now too, anger making my voice stronger than it had been in months. He was helping his family while neglecting his own health, his own bills, his own future. You don't understand the whole situation. Then explain it to me. I slammed my hand on the table, making the bills scatter. Explain how my husband had rental properties I didn't know about, medical bills I didn't know about, and a family that apparently knew more about his finances than his own wife did. David backed toward the door. I think you need to calm down, Sarah. Grief can make people paranoid, make them see connections that aren't really there. Don't you dare tell me how to grieve, I said, following him. And don't you dare gaslight me about my own husband's finances. Nobody's gaslighting anyone, he said, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. Look, maybe it's time to seriously consider selling the house. These medical bills aren't going away, and with Marcus gone, you can't afford to keep up with everything. It would be easier for everyone if you could start fresh somewhere else. After he left, I sat in my kitchen surrounded by medical bills and bank statements, feeling like I was drowning in secrets. Marcus had been sick, possibly seriously sick, and he'd hidden it from me while bankrupting himself to support his family. The man I'd thought I knew completely had been living a parallel life of financial stress and health scares, but the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. Not at Marcus. I understood his impulse to protect me. I was angry at his family. They'd known about his heart problems. They'd known about the medical bills. They'd known he was struggling financially, and they'd kept taking money from him anyway. Patricia's daily calls, David's casual visits, Jennifer's silence, it was all starting to make sense. They weren't grieving Marcus's death. They were managing the fallout from it. They were trying to control the narrative, control me, control whatever Marcus had discovered before he died. 6 more days until I could open whatever Marcus had left for me. 6 more days until I learned the truth that he'd been so desperate to document. Looking at those medical bills, at the evidence of my husband's secret suffering, I realized that Patricia was right about one thing. This was just the beginning. The medical bills had shaken me, but they'd also given me a new sense of purpose. If Marcus had been hiding his health problems to protect me, what else had he been protecting me from? I spent the next 2 days going through every piece of financial paperwork in our house with the methodical determination of a detective. What I found made my blood run cold. Marcus's business checking account, the one he'd maintained separately for business expenses, told a story I never could have imagined. For the past 3 years, there had been regular deposits of $12,000 every month from something called Rodriguez Property Management LLC. Money I'd never known existed, from a business I'd never heard of. But it was the withdrawals that made my hands shake. Thousands of dollars, sometimes weekly, going to Patricia Rodriguez. Not payments to a property management company, not business expenses, personal transfers to his mother's checking account. I pulled out my laptop and started researching Rodriguez Property Management. What I found was a limited liability company registered in Louisiana with Marcus Rodriguez listed as the sole owner and operator. The business owned 4 rental properties, in New Orleans, all purchased between 2003 and 2004, all generating substantial monthly income. For properties, Marcus owned for rental properties that I'd never known about, never seen, never been told about in 3 years of marriage. I grabbed my car keys and drove to the first address listed in the LLC. Paperwork: a shotgun double on Magazine Street, about 2 miles from our house. It was a charming place, freshly painted, with a for rent sign in the yard showing a phone number I didn't recognize. The second property was a Creole cottage in Bywater, beautifully restored, clearly worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The third was a Victorian mansion in the Garden district that had been converted into 4 high-end apartments. The fourth property made my heart stop. It was Patricia's house in the French Quarter. The house she'd claimed had been in the Rodriguez family for generations, the house where she'd held court like some kind of property matriarch, the house she'd used to intimidate me with its weight of family history. Marcus owned his mother's house. I sat in my car outside Patricia's wrought iron gate, staring up at the balconies and ancient brick walls, trying to process what this meant. According to the property records I'd found, Marcus had purchased the house in 2003 for $340,000, then spent another $150,000 on renovations. His mother lived there rent-free, but Marcus owned it. The bank statements told the rest of the story. Patricia had been receiving anywhere from $3,000 to $8,000 every month from Marcus's property management account. Not rent payments, she wasn't paying rent at all. These were just transfers, money flowing from my husband to his mother for no apparent reason. But here's what made it worse. The amounts had increased dramatically over the past year. In 2004, Patricia had received maybe $3,000 a month. By early 2005, it was closer to $8,000. The transfers had doubled right around the time Marcus started having chest pains and seeing the cardiologist. I drove home in a daze, but I wasn't done investigating. If Marcus had been supporting his mother to this extent, what about David and Jennifer? David's bank account information was harder to find, but I discovered something almost as revealing in Marcus's paperwork. Loan documents? Marcus had co-signed for David's car, David's credit cards, even David's apartment lease. Every financial decision David made seemed to involve Marcus as a guarantor, but David wasn't making payments on any of these loans. The monthly statements showed that Marcus was covering everything: car payments, credit card minimums, even David's rent. My brother-in-law was living completely off Marcus's money while working only part-time as a bartender. Jennifer's situation was more sophisticated but equally devastating. Marcus had invested in her real estate career, providing the down payment for her to purchase properties that she then flipped for profit. According to the contracts I found, Jennifer was supposed to pay Marcus back 50% of any profits, but I couldn't find evidence of a single repayment. Instead, there were more loans. Marcus had funded Jennifer's real estate license, her car, her designer wardrobe, even her marketing budget. She'd built her entire career on Marcus's money, and from what I could tell, she'd never paid back a single dollar. The pattern was clear. Marcus's family had been financially dependent on him for years, not just accepting help during emergencies, but living entirely off his success while contributing nothing in return. But where had Marcus gotten the money to support 3 adult family members, plus maintain rental properties worth over $1 million? His Coast Guard salary was decent, but it wasn't enough to fund this kind of lifestyle for 5 people. That's when I found the life insurance policies hidden in Marcus's filing cabinet underneath tax returns and property deeds. Were insurance policies I'd never seen before. Not just the standard Coast Guard life insurance that I'd known about, but private policies worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. 3 separate policies, each with Patricia Rodriguez listed as the beneficiary. Not me, his wife, his mother. The total death benefit was $750,000. I sat on our bedroom floor, surrounded by paperwork that painted a picture of systematic financial manipulation. Marcus's family hadn't just been taking his money, they'd been positioning themselves to profit from his death. But here's what I couldn't understand. Why would Marcus allow this? The man I'd married was intelligent, responsible, protective of our future together. Why would he structure his entire financial life around supporting people who were essentially using him? Then I remembered his notebook, the entry about not seeing the pattern before. Marcus hadn't been complicit in this arrangement. He'd been a victim of it. And sometime in the months before his death, he'd started to figure that out. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Marcus hadn't died just carrying the weight of supporting his family. He'd died realizing that his family had been manipulating and stealing from him for years. He'd died knowing that the people he'd trusted most had betrayed him completely, and now they were trying to do the same thing to me. Patricia's pressure about the house, David's hints about my inability to handle Marcus's finances, Jennifer's silent complicity. They weren't helping me through grief. They were managing me, controlling me, trying to make sure I never discovered what Marcus had spent his final months uncovering. 4 more days until I could open Marcus's letter. 4 more days until I learned exactly what evidence he'd gathered and what he'd planned to do about it. But I already knew enough to understand why Patricia was so eager to get me out of the house and away from Marcus's papers. I knew enough to realize that my husband hadn't just been protecting me from knowledge, he'd been protecting me from his own family, and I knew enough to be afraid of what they might do when they realized I was starting to figure out the truth. November 24th. 4 days until I could open Marcus's letter, and the tension in my house felt like a ticking bomb. Patricia's daily calls had become increasingly aggressive. David's friendly visits more frequent and pointed. Even Jennifer had started showing up, ostensibly to check on me, but really to ask probing questions about what I was doing with Marcus's papers. I'd started keeping everything locked in our bedroom: the bank statements, the property records, the medical bills, all the evidence of their financial manipulation, but I could feel them circling like vultures, sensing that something had changed in my attitude even if they couldn't pinpoint what. "Sarah, you've seemed different lately," Patricia said during Thursday morning's call. "More ... agitated? Are you getting enough sleep? Grief can cause all sorts of mental health issues if it's not properly managed." The implication was clear. If I wasn't careful, they'd start questioning my mental competency. Another angle of attack, another way to discredit me if I became inconvenient. "I'm fine, Patricia. Just working through some of Marcus's paperwork." "What kind of paperwork?" Her voice sharpened slightly. "Because some of those documents might be confusing without proper context. Financial matters can be complicated, especially for someone without experience in business." "I'm managing." "Are you, though? Because David mentioned that you seemed upset when he brought over those medical bills. We're concerned that you might be overwhelmed by information you don't fully understand." I almost laughed at the audacity. Here was a woman who'd been stealing from her own son for years, expressing concern about my ability to understand financial documents. "Patricia, I appreciate your concern, but I'm perfectly capable of understanding Marcus's finances." "Of course, you are, dear. But there might be aspects of his business dealings that seem unusual to someone outside the family." Marcus was very private about certain arrangements. There it was, the warning. They knew I was discovering things, and they wanted me to understand that they had explanations, justifications, ways to make everything seem reasonable if I started asking the wrong questions, but I was done playing their game. "What arrangements?" I asked directly. A pause. "Well, for instance, the property management business, that was a family enterprise, something Marcus inherited from his father. The financial structures might seem irregular to an outsider, but they made perfect sense within the context of family obligations. Family obligations. Marcus felt responsible for his mother and siblings, naturally. After his father died so young, Marcus stepped into the role of family provider. The property income was always meant to support the whole family, not just Marcus individually. It was smooth. I had to give her credit. She was rewriting history in real time, turning Marcus's financial exploitation into noble family duty. If I hadn't seen the dates on those property purchases, hadn't traced the timeline of the loans and transfers, I might have believed her. So the properties were family assets in spirit? Yes. Legally, of course, Marcus held the titles for tax purposes, but the intent was always family support. That's why it's so important that these arrangements continue as Marcus would have wanted. And what Marcus would have wanted was ... for his family to be taken care of naturally, for the properties to continue generating income for his mother's retirement, for David's future, for Jennifer's business. Marcus would want his legacy to provide security for the people he loved. The manipulation was breathtaking. Patricia was trying to convince me that Marcus's financial exploitation had been his own idea, his own desire. That continuing to fund their lifestyle wasn't theft. It was honoring his memory. "What about what Marcus wanted for me?" I asked. Another pause, longer this time. "Well, naturally, Marcus wanted you to be happy and secure too. But, Sarah, you're young, you're healthy, you have your teaching career, you can build a new life, find love again. But his mother, his siblings, this is all we have. These properties, this support system, it's our only security." The emotional manipulation was expert level. Poor Patricia, the aging mother, with no other resources. Poor David and Jennifer, dependent on their brother's generosity. And me, young enough to start over, selfish enough to want to disrupt their security. Except that every word was a lie. After she hung up, I went back to Marcus's appointment calendar, the one I'd found in his desk drawer. The final month of his life was meticulously documented, and now that I understood what to look for, the pattern was clear. August 2nd, Meeting with attorney estate planning, August 9th. Bank appointment, asset review, August 15th. Private. Investigator consultation, August 22nd. Second meeting with PI report review. Marcus had hired a private investigator. In the weeks before Hurricane Katrina, while his family was pressuring him for more money and his heart condition was getting worse, Marcus had been building a case against them, but it was the final entry that made my blood run cold. August 28th. Family confrontation. Have all evidence ready the day before the hurricane hit. The day Marcus had packed his Coast Guard gear and kissed me goodbye for the last time. He'd been planning to confront his family about their financial abuse, to present them with evidence and demand accountability. But Katrina had hit first, and Marcus had died before he could expose what they'd been doing, which meant that his family knew he'd been investigating them. They knew he'd discovered their manipulation, and they knew that somewhere in his papers was evidence that could destroy them. No wonder they'd been so aggressive about getting me to clean out his belongings. No wonder Patricia was so concerned about my confusion regarding his financial documents. They weren't just trying to continue their exploitation, they were trying to cover up years of theft before I could discover it. But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd assumed that Marcus hadn't told me about the 90-day waiting period. They thought they had time to manipulate me, to convince me to sign over properties and assets before I understood what was really happening. They didn't know that in 3 days I'd have access to whatever evidence Marcus had been gathering. They didn't know that their victim had been smart enough to protect his wife from their manipulation. But looking at that calendar, at the evidence of Marcus's final desperate attempt to save our financial future from his own family, I realized something terrifying. They'd been willing to steal from him for years. While he was alive and healthy, what might they be willing to do to a grieving widow who was getting too close to the truth? November 28th arrived, gray and cold, matching my mood as I sat at our kitchen table with Marcus's key in my hand. 90 days exactly since Hurricane Katrina had taken my husband's life. 90 days of grief, manipulation, and slowly unraveling lies. I'd barely slept the night before, wondering what Marcus had hidden away. What truth was so devastating that it required this elaborate protection plan? Part of me was terrified to know. The evidence I'd already found painted his family as manipulative and greedy. But Marcus's warnings suggested something even worse. Patricia had called twice that morning, ostensibly to check on me during what she called this difficult milestone day, but I could hear the tension in her voice, the barely concealed anxiety about what I might be planning to do. I drove to the Bank of Louisiana downtown, where Marcus had maintained a safety deposit box I'd never known about. The key fit perfectly, and the bank officer led me to a small, windowless room where I could examine the contents privately. Inside the metal box was a manila envelope with "For Sarah" written in Marcus's careful handwriting. My hands were shaking as I opened it and pulled out a sealed letter along with a smaller envelope marked "Evidence." I opened the letter first. "My dearest Sarah," it began. "If you're reading this, then something has happened to me and you've waited the full 90 days as I asked. I pray that you've been strong during this time, and I'm sorry for the pain you must be feeling. But what I'm about to tell you will hurt worse than my death, and I need you to be prepared for that. For the past 6 months, I've been discovering that my family has been stealing from me for years. Not just borrowing money or accepting help, systematically stealing through forged documents, identity theft, and emotional manipulation. The evidence in the second envelope will show you everything, but I want you to hear it from me first. My mother has been forging my signature on loans and credit applications since 2003. She used my identity to secure mortgages on properties that she then claimed as family assets. The house she lives in isn't a family heirloom. Mike bought it for her, but she convinced the neighbors and even some family friends that it belonged to her deceased husband. I had to stop reading. The page was blurring through my tears, and I could barely process what Marcus was telling me. Patricia, the woman who'd criticized my grief and tried to claim Marcus's memorial flag, had been committing identity theft against her own son for years. David has been even worse, the letter continued. He's used my credit to fund a lifestyle he's never earned. Every car, every apartment, every credit card, all in my name, all my responsibility. But Sarah, the worst part is that he's been selling drugs using money from the properties to fund his inventory. I have bank records showing transfers that coincide with police reports about drug activity in his neighborhood. My brother-in-law was a drug dealer, the sweet, apologetic man who'd been bringing me medical bills and expressing concern about my mental state was funding a drug business with money stolen from Marcus. Jennifer's betrayal cuts deepest because she's been the most calculating. She convinced me to invest in her real estate business by claiming she wanted to honor Dad's memory through property development. But she's been using my investments to fund personal expenses while hiding the profits in accounts I can't access. Worse, she's been feeding information about our finances to Mom and David, helping them target our most vulnerable assets. The three people who'd welcomed me into their family, who'd called me sister and daughter, had been operating as a criminal conspiracy against Marcus for years, and now they were trying to do the same thing to me. But Sarah, the reason I'm so scared, the reason I hired a private investigator and prepared this evidence, is because I think they know I figured it out. David made some threats last month when I questioned him about loan payments. Mom has been pressuring me to change my will, to think about family obligations if something happens to me. And Jennifer keeps asking about life insurance policies and property titles. I think they're planning something. Maybe not to hurt me physically, but certainly to accelerate their access to my assets. The timing of this hurricane, of my Coast Guard deployment, it feels too convenient. I'm probably being paranoid, but I can't shake the feeling that they're waiting for an opportunity. My stomach lurched. Marcus had suspected that his family might try to benefit from his death. He'd died thinking that the people he loved most were capable of wishing him harm for financial gain. The evidence envelope contains bank records, forged documents, recorded conversations, and a full report from the private investigator I hired. There's enough there to file criminal charges and recover most of the stolen assets. But Sarah, I need you to be careful. If they discover that you have this information, they might try to discredit you or worse. I've also included instructions for accessing accounts they don't know about, safe deposit boxes in other banks, and legal contacts who can help you. You're not alone in this, even though it will feel that way. My greatest regret is that I didn't tell you sooner. I wanted to protect you from this ugliness, but I realize now that I left you vulnerable instead. You deserved to know what kind of people you were dealing with. You deserved to make informed decisions about our family relationships. But Sarah, here's what I need you to understand. You owe them nothing. Not loyalty, not support, not even the benefit of the doubt. They chose to betray me, to steal from us, to put their greed above family love. Whatever consequences they face are consequences they earned. Fight for yourself, baby. Fight for our future, even if I'm not there to share it. Use this evidence to take back what they stole and build the life we dreamed about. And know that wherever I am, I'm proud of your strength and grateful for your love. Forever yours, Marcus. P.S. The safety deposit box also contains my grandmother's engagement ring, the one I never told you about because Mom claimed it was lost. I was saving it for our 5th anniversary. I hope you'll wear it and remember that our love was real even when everything else feels like a lie. I sat in that tiny bank room sobbing over my husband's letter, overwhelmed by grief and rage and love all at once. Marcus had spent his final months not just fighting a heart condition and preparing for a hurricane, but building a case against his own family's criminal behavior. And he'd been right to be paranoid. They had been waiting for an opportunity, and his death in Hurricane Katrina had given them exactly what they needed. A grieving, isolated widow who could be manipulated into giving up everything. But Marcus had outplayed them, even from beyond the grave. He'd protected me with evidence and resources, and the truth they'd tried so hard to hide. I opened the evidence envelope with steady hands now, ready to see exactly how deep their betrayal went. Ready to understand the full scope of what I was fighting for, ready to honor my husband's final wish by fighting back against the people who'd stolen from us for years. It was time to stop being a victim and start being a widow with a mission. The evidence envelope contained a nightmare documented in meticulous detail. Marcus hadn't just suspected his family's betrayal. He'd built an airtight case against them with the thoroughness of someone who'd worked in law enforcement. The first document was a private investigator's report, stamped and signed by someone named Detective Ray Broussard, a former NOPD officer who'd gone into private practice. 23 pages of surveillance, financial analysis, and documented fraud spanning 3 years. According to Broussard's investigation, Patricia had been using Marcus's identity since 2003 to secure loans, open credit accounts, and even apply for government assistance programs. The evidence included photocopies of forged signatures, bank applications with falsified information, and loan documents that Marcus had never seen. But the scope of the fraud was staggering. Patricia hadn't just stolen money, she'd stolen Marcus's entire financial identity, credit cards, personal loans, even a business loan for a catering company she'd never operated. The total amount of debt she'd accumulated in Marcus's name was over $200,000. The report included photographs of Patricia entering banks with forged identification, audio recordings of her claiming to be Marcus's power of attorney during phone calls with financial institutions, and bank surveillance footage that clearly showed her conducting transactions on accounts she had no legal right to access. David's section was equally damning. Beyond the drug dealing Marcus had mentioned, David had been running multiple cons using Marcus's money and credit. He'd taken out loans for cars he immediately sold, opened credit accounts for expensive electronics that he resold online, and even applied for small business loans using fake business plans. But here's what made my blood run cold. David had been preparing to expand his operation. The investigator had documented meetings between David and known drug distributors, photographed large cash transactions, and recorded conversations about using the Rodriguez properties as distribution centers. David wasn't just stealing from Marcus, he was planning to turn Marcus's rental properties into drug houses. Jennifer's betrayal was more sophisticated but equally devastating. As a real estate agent, she'd had access to legal and financial tools that her mother and brother couldn't use. She'd been creating fake property transfers, fraudulent real estate deals, and investment schemes that existed only on paper. The investigator had uncovered evidence that Jennifer was working with corrupt mortgage brokers to inflate property values, then splitting the excess loan proceeds with her co-conspirators. She'd been using Marcus's properties as collateral for deals he'd never authorized, putting our entire financial future at risk. But the worst part was the timeline. All of this had escalated dramatically in the months before Marcus's death. Patricia's loan applications had increased from monthly to weekly. David's cash transactions had grown larger and more frequent. Jennifer had been pushing more and more aggressive real estate schemes. It was like they'd known that their window of opportunity was closing, that Marcus was getting suspicious, and they'd decided to grab everything they could before he stopped them. The final section of the report included recorded conversations that made me physically sick. Hidden audio from family gatherings where they discussed Marcus like he was an ATM machine, planning how to extract more money, joking about his gullibility and his desperate need to be the perfect son. In one recording from a Sunday dinner in July, I could hear Patricia's voice clearly. Marcus is getting too nosy about the bank statements. We need to be more careful. Maybe space out the withdrawals. David's response was chilling. Or maybe we need to speed things up. If he's catching on, we might not have much time left. Jennifer's voice joined in. The life insurance policies are substantial. If something were to happen to Marcus, we'd be set for life. Maybe it's time to start thinking about ... alternatives. I had to stop the recording. They'd been discussing Marcus's life insurance like they were planning his death. Not metaphorically, not as a distant possibility, as a practical consideration in their financial planning. But the evidence envelope contained more than just the investigator's report. Marcus had also included bank records showing the true scope of their theft, legal documents proving his ownership of assets they'd claimed, and most importantly, recordings he'd made himself during the final weeks of his life. The last recording was dated August 27th, the day before he left for his final Coast Guard mission. Marcus's voice was tired but determined as he spoke into what must have been a small recording device. This is Marcus Rodriguez, and I'm documenting what I believe to be criminal conspiracy by my family members to defraud me and potentially harm me for financial gain. If something happens to me in the coming days or weeks, I want Sarah to know that I was aware of the threats and I was preparing to expose everything. I've given copies of all evidence to Detective Broussard, who has instructions to turn everything over to the FBI if I die under suspicious circumstances. I've also prepared financial protection for Sarah, including accounts and assets that my family doesn't know about. I love my family, but I won't let them destroy Sarah's future along with mine. If they think my death will give them access to everything I've worked for, they're wrong. I've made sure that Sarah will have the resources and evidence to fight back. To Sarah, if you're hearing this, I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I'm sorry I let it get this bad, but I promise you have everything you need to protect yourself and build a new life. Don't let them make you feel guilty for fighting back. They chose this path. The recording ended there, but the safety deposit box contained one more surprise. Hidden beneath all the documents was a small velvet jewelry box containing the most beautiful engagement ring I'd ever seen, a vintage Art Deco design with a center diamond surrounded by sapphires. Marcus's grandmother's ring, the one Patricia had claimed was lost. There was also a note tucked inside the ring box for our 5th anniversary, or for your new beginning. Either way, you deserve all the beauty in the world. I sat in that bank room, holding my husband's grandmother's ring and listening to his voice from beyond the grave, understanding finally that Marcus hadn't just died in Hurricane Katrina, he'd died knowing that his own family was planning to profit from his death, knowing that they viewed him as more valuable, dead than alive. I left the bank that afternoon with Marcus's grandmother's ring on my finger and a burning sense of purpose in my chest. The grief was still there, it would always be there, but now it was accompanied by something stronger, righteous anger and absolute determination. The first thing I did was call Detective Ray Broussard, the private investigator whose business card Marcus had included with the evidence. His office was in a converted shotgun house in Mid-City, and when I arrived an hour later, he greeted me like he'd been expecting this call for months. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he said, shaking my hand with the firm grip of someone who'd spent decades in law enforcement. I'm sorry for your loss, and I'm sorry you had to discover all this. Marcus was a good man who got caught up in a bad situation. Broussard was in his 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes that had obviously seen too much human ugliness. His office was cluttered with case files and coffee cups, but organized in the way that spoke of someone who understood the importance of details. Detective Broussard, just Ray, please. I left the police force 5 years ago. He gestured for me to sit down. Marcus hired me because he suspected his family was stealing from him, but he needed proof before he could act. What he discovered was worse than either of us expected. How much worse? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Ray pulled out a thick file folder. The evidence Marcus gathered could support criminal charges for identity theft, fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. We're talking potential federal crimes because some of the stolen funds crossed state lines. Your husband built a case that could put his family in prison for 10 to 20 years. The weight of that statement settled over me. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about justice for years of systematic betrayal. But here's what Marcus was most concerned about, Ray continued. The escalation pattern. In my experience, when financial criminals start feeling cornered, they get desperate, and desperate people make dangerous decisions. You think they would have hurt Marcus? I think they were already planning for his death to solve their problems. The life insurance policies, the increased theft activity, the conversations about alternatives, all classic signs of people who've crossed the line from opportunistic crime to premeditated gain. Ray opened another folder and showed me documents I hadn't seen in the safety deposit box, bank records showing that Patricia had been shopping for additional life insurance policies on Marcus without his knowledge. Applications that had been rejected because they required Marcus's signature, but the attempts were documented. She tried to take out $1 million policy on Marcus just 6 weeks before Katrina hit, Ray explained. When that didn't work, she started pressuring him to increase his existing policies. Marcus was smart enough to refuse, but it shows you where her mind was. I thought about Patricia's behavior at the memorial service, her eagerness to claim Marcus's flag, her immediate pressure about the house and properties. She hadn't been grieving, she'd been calculating. What do I do now? I asked. That depends on what you want to accomplish, Ray said. We have enough evidence to file criminal charges and recover most of the stolen assets, but you need to understand that going after them legally means declaring war on Marcus's family. Are you prepared for that? I looked down at Marcus's grandmother's ring, thinking about my husband's final recording. His determination to protect me, even after death. They declared war on us years ago, I said. I'm just finally fighting back. Ray smiled grimly. Good, because they're not going to make this easy. First thing we need to do is secure your assets before they realize you know the truth. They're probably expecting you to sign over properties and accounts in the next few weeks. Instead, we're going to document everything they've stolen and filed charges. Over the next 2 hours, Ray walked me through the legal strategy Marcus had helped develop. The first step was contacting the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit with evidence of the interstate fraud. The second was filing civil lawsuits to recover stolen assets and void fraudulent contracts. The third was protecting myself from retaliation. Retaliation? I asked. Sarah, these people have been stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from Marcus for years. They're facing serious prison time and financial ruin. They might try to discredit you, claim you're mentally unstable from grief, maybe even try to have you declared incompetent so they can control Marcus's estate. The thought was terrifying but not surprising. Patricia had already started questioning my mental state. David had hinted about my inability to handle complex financial matters, and Jennifer had been suspiciously absent from recent conversations. What can I do to protect myself? Document everything. Record all conversations with them from now on. Louisiana is a one-party consent state, so you don't need their permission. Get a lawyer who specializes in financial crimes, and most importantly, don't let them know what you've discovered until we're ready to act. Ray gave me the name of an attorney Marcus had consulted, Rebecca Tran, a former federal prosecutor who now handled complex financial crime cases. He also provided me with recording equipment and instructions for documenting any future contact with the Rodriguez family. How long do we have before they get suspicious? I asked. Maybe a week, maybe less. They've been watching you closely since the memorial service, trying to gauge how much you know. Your behavior over the next few days will determine whether they panic or continue with their current approach. I drove home with a clear plan but a heavy heart. Marcus had spent his final months building this case, preparing for a confrontation that Hurricane Katrina had made impossible. Now it was up to me to finish what he'd started, but I also understood that I was about to destroy what remained of the Rodriguez family. Patricia, David, and Jennifer weren't just going to lose their illegal income, they were going to lose their freedom. their reputations, and their futures. Part of me felt guilty about that. These were people I'd called family, people I'd shared holidays and celebrations with, people who'd welcomed me into their lives when Marcus and I got married. But then I remembered the recording of them discussing Marcus's life insurance, their casual jokes about his gullibility, their systematic theft of money that should have secured our future together. They'd made their choices. They'd chosen greed over love, exploitation over family, criminal conspiracy over honesty. Marcus had tried to protect them by keeping their crimes secret, but they'd repaid his loyalty by planning to profit from his death. Now they were going to face the consequences of those choices. I spent that evening organizing evidence and preparing for battle, wearing Marcus's grandmother's ring as a reminder of the love and trust they'd betrayed. Tomorrow I would start making calls, filing reports, and setting in motion the legal machinery that would bring them to justice. But tonight, I allowed myself to grieve, not just for Marcus, but for the family I'd thought I knew, the relationships I'd believed were real, and the innocence I'd lost in discovering how deep human betrayal could go. The next morning, I called Patricia before I could lose my nerve. Ray had given me a small recording device that looked like a regular pen, and I tested it twice before. Dialing her number, my hands were steady, but my heart was pounding as I waited for her to answer. "Sarah, dear, how lovely to hear from you. I was just thinking about you this morning. Patricia, I need to talk to you about Marcus's finances. I've been going through his papers, and I have some questions." A pause. "Of course, sweetheart. What kind of questions?" "Well, I found some discrepancies in his bank records, large withdrawals that I don't understand, transfers to accounts I don't recognize. I was hoping you could help me make sense of it all." "Oh my." Her voice had shifted slightly, becoming more careful. "Well, Marcus did handle a lot of family financial matters. He was very generous with his support. You know, perhaps what you're seeing are the transfers he made to help with family emergencies totaling $47,000 in 1 year." Silence stretched between us. I could practically hear Patricia calculating, trying to decide how much I actually knew. "Sarah, I think perhaps you're misinterpreting some of the records. Financial documents can be confusing if you don't understand the context." "Then help me understand the context, Patricia. Help me understand why Marcus was sending you $8,000 a month while he couldn't pay his own medical bills." Another pause, longer this time. When Patricia spoke again, her voice had lost all pretense of warmth. "I think you need to be very careful about the accusations you're making, Sarah. Grief can make people paranoid, make them see conspiracies where none exist. Is that what this is? Paranoia?" I pulled out the bank statements Ray had helped me organize, because I have documentation of every transfer, every withdrawal, every loan application. "I know about the second mortgage on the house, Patricia. I know about the credit cards, the business loans, the life insurance applications." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear Patricia breathing, could almost feel her mind racing as she realized how much I'd discovered Sarah. Her voice was different now, harder, more calculating. "I think you're upset and confused. You're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in months. Are you? Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you're having some kind of breakdown, accusing your family of..." "What? Exactly. Stealing, fraud. These are serious allegations, dear. The kind that could make people question your mental stability." There it was, the threat Ray had warned me about. If I pushed too hard, they'd try to have me declared mentally incompetent. "Patricia, I know what Marcus discovered before he died. I know about the forged signatures, the identity theft, the fake business loans. I know everything. You know nothing." The mask slipped completely now, and Patricia's real voice came through, sharp, angry, desperate. "You've been married to my son for 3 years, Sarah. 3 years. I raised him. I sacrificed for him. I deserve to be taken care of in my old age. By stealing from him, by accepting what he owed me. Do you have any idea what it cost to raise 3 children alone? What I gave up to make sure Marcus had every opportunity? That money was payback for years of sacrifice." I was recording every word, but I was also genuinely shocked by the venom in her voice. This wasn't the Patricia who'd welcomed me into the family, who'd called me daughter, who'd seemed to care about Marcus's happiness. "Patricia, you committed identity theft. You forged his signature on loans worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. I did what I had to do to survive. Marcus was too selfish to see how much his family needed him. He was too busy playing house with you to remember his obligations to the people who actually mattered. The people who actually mattered. His real family. His blood. Not some little teacher who thinks 3 years of marriage makes her entitled to everything he worked for." The cruelty in her voice was breathtaking. This woman had sat next to me at Marcus's memorial service, had criticized my grief while knowing she'd been stealing from him for years. "Marcus loved me. Patricia, Marcus was infatuated with you. There's a difference. If he'd lived long enough, he would have figured that out. He would have realized that family obligations come first, that his wife's needs are secondary to his mother's security. Is that why you tried to take out additional life insurance policies on him? To secure your future? Another silence. I'd caught her off guard again. I don't know what you're talking about. The $1 million policy you applied for 6 weeks. Before Katrina, the one that required his signature, which you couldn't forge convincingly enough to fool the insurance company. You're delusional. I have the application, Patricia. I have the rejection letters. I have recordings of you and David and Jennifer discussing how valuable Marcus was to you dead. The line went quiet for so long that I thought she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was ice cold. You have no idea what you're dealing with, Sarah. No idea what we're capable of when we're protecting our family. Are you threatening me? I'm warning you. Drop this nonsense. Sign over the properties like a good widow and disappear quietly. Build a new life somewhere else and forget about things that don't concern you. Everything Marcus owned concerns me. I was his wife. You were a temporary inconvenience. A phase he was going through. If you think we're going to let some outsider destroy everything we've built, you're more naive than I thought. What you've built was constructed on theft and lies. What we've built is a family legacy that will continue long after you're forgotten. Marcus understood that, even if he lost sight of it temporarily, the properties, the assets, the financial arrangements, they were always meant to support the Rodriguez family, not you. Then you should have thought about that before you committed multiple felonies to steal from your own son. Patricia's laugh was harsh and bitter. Prove it, little girl. Take your paranoid theories and your grief-induced fantasies too. Whoever will listen. See how far you get trying to convince the world that a grieving mother stole from her dead son? I will prove it. No, you won't. Because we know things about you too, Sarah. About your marriage. About your mental health. About your fitness to handle Marcus's estate. If you want to play games, we can play games. But you won't win. She hung up without another word, leaving me sitting in my kitchen with a recording device full of threats and confessions, my hands shaking with adrenaline and rage. Patricia had just confirmed everything Marcus had suspected. She felt entitled to his money, justified in her theft, and completely unremorseful about the years of betrayal. Worse, she'd made it clear that they had plans to discredit me if I continued investigating. But she'd also made a critical mistake. She'd confessed to the fraud on a recorded line, admitted to the insurance applications, and threatened retaliation. Ray would be very interested in this conversation. I sat in the quiet kitchen, looking at Marcus's grandmother's ring on my finger, and made a decision. They wanted to play games. They wanted to threaten and intimidate me into silence. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I wasn't just a grieving widow anymore. I was a woman with evidence, legal backing, and nothing left to lose. The war Patricia had been waging against Marcus for years was about to become my war, and I intended to win. After Patricia's threatening phone call, I knew I had to move quickly. Ray had warned me that once they realized how much I knew, they might try to hide evidence or intimidate me into silence. What I hadn't expected was David showing up at my door that same evening, acting like nothing had changed. "Hey, Sarah," he said when I opened the door, flashing that familiar smile that looked so much like Marcus's. "Mom said you called her today, with some questions about Marcus's finances. I thought maybe I could help clear things up." I studied his face, looking for signs of the man who'd been caught on recording, discussing my husband's life insurance value. He seemed calm, almost casual, but there was something different in his ISA calculating look that I'd never noticed before. "Come in," I said, stepping back to let him enter. The recording device was already in my pocket, activated before I'd answered the door. David settled into Marcus's favorite chair, a detail that bothered me more than it should have. We'd been family for 3 years, but now every familiar gesture felt like a violation. "So what's got you confused about the finances?" he asked, his tone gentle and concerned. "I know this stuff can be overwhelming when you're dealing with grief. I found some records that don't make sense to me," I said carefully. "Large amounts of money that Marcus was lending to family members. I'm trying to understand what those arrangements were." David nodded sympathetically. "Yeah, Marcus was always helping us out. He felt responsible for the family after Dad died. You know, sometimes he'd help with rent, car payments, emergency expenses. He never wanted us to struggle. $47,000 in 1 year seems like more than occasional help." A flicker of something annoyance, fear, crossed David's face. Well, Marcus was doing well financially. The Coast Guard salary, plus the rental properties, plus some investments. He could afford to be generous. "What investments?" "Oh, you?" "No. Real estate stuff, some business ventures." Marcus was always looking for ways to grow the family wealth. I pulled out a bank statement that Ray had helped me analyze. This shows a transfer of $5,000 to your account on the same day that Marcus couldn't make a payment on his medical bills. How do you explain that? David's expression hardened slightly. I don't think I need to explain my personal financial arrangements with my brother to anyone, Sarah. Those were private family matters. Private family matters that involved forged signatures and identity theft. The mask slipped. David leaned forward, his voice dropping to a more threatening tone. What exactly are you accusing me of? I'm not accusing you of anything, David. I'm stating facts based on documented evidence. You've been using Marcus's credit and identity to fund a lifestyle you never earned. You don't know what you're talking about. I pulled out another document, the investigator's report detailing David's drug dealing activities, then explained this. Bank transfers from Marcus's accounts that match the timing of drug transactions in your neighborhood. Explain how you've been using my husband's money to fund illegal activities. David stood up abruptly, his friendly facade completely gone. You need to be very careful, Sarah. Very careful about the accusations you're making. Or what? Or you might find yourself in a situation you can't handle. You're a grieving widow who's clearly having some kind of mental breakdown, making wild accusations about drug dealing and fraud. That's the kind of behavior that makes people question whether you're fit to handle Marcus's estate. There it was again, the threat to have me declared mentally incompetent. They'd clearly coordinated this strategy. The only person having a breakdown here is you, David, because you know I have evidence of everything you've done. What evidence? His voice was sharp now, desperate. Some bank statements that you're misinterpreting? Some paranoid theories about family helping family? I pulled out the photographs from the investigator's report, images of David meeting with known drug dealers, exchanging cash for packages, conducting business in locations that Marcus's money had funded. David's face went white. Where did you get those? Marcus hired a private investigator. He knew what you were doing, David. He knew about the drugs, the stolen money, the fake loans. He was building a case against you before he died. That's impossible. Marcus loved you. But he wasn't stupid. He figured out that his little brother was stealing from him to fund a drug business. How do you think that made him feel, knowing that his generosity was being used to poison our community? David began pacing, running his hands through his hair. You don't understand the pressure I was under. The debts, the people I owed money to. Marcus had more than enough he could afford to help. He could afford to help because he was working 60-hour weeks and risking his life with the Coast Guard while you were dealing drugs. I never asked him to risk his life. That was his choice. And stealing his identity, forging his signature, using his property as collateral for drug money? Were those your choices, or his? David stopped pacing and turned to face me, his expression dangerous. You need to stop this, Sarah, right now. Drop whatever investigation you think you're doing and walk away. I'm not walking away from anything. Marcus died trying to expose what you people were doing, and I'm going to finish what he started. Marcus died in a hurricane. He died because he was too stubborn to evacuate like a normal person. Marcus died because he was a hero trying to save lives. While you were back here planning how to spend his life insurance money, David's face twisted with rage. You think you're so righteous, don't you? You think you understand our family, our obligations, our history. But you're nothing, Sarah. You're a teacher who got lucky enough to marry above her station for 3 years. I was Marcus's wife. I was his partner, his choice, his future. You were a phase, a temporary distraction from his real responsibilities. Marcus belonged to this family long before he met you, and his legacy belongs to us long after you're gone. His legacy is going to be exposing the people who betrayed him. David stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. Let me make something very clear to you, Sarah. This family has survived poverty, tragedy, and loss for generations. We've done whatever it takes to protect what's ours. If you think we're going to let some outsider destroy everything we've built, you're delusional. Are you threatening me, David? I'm educating you about the reality of your situation. You're alone, you're grieving, and you're making accusations against people who have deep roots in this community. How do you think that's going to end for you? Who'd pretended to comfort me while stealing from my dead husband? The transformation was complete. The mask was off, and I could see the predator underneath. It's going to end with you in prison, I said quietly. David laughed, but there was no humor in it. Good luck with that. Good luck convincing anyone that a grieving widow's paranoid theories are more credible than a family's word. Good luck explaining why you're attacking the people who loved Marcus most. He headed toward the door, then turned back one final time. You have 24 hours to reconsider this path you're on. After that, we stop being patient with your grief-induced delusions. After he left, I sat in my living room, shaking with adrenaline and fury. David had just confessed to financial fraud, threatened me directly, and made it clear that the Rodriguez family viewed me as an enemy to be eliminated. But he'd also given me exactly what I needed. A recorded confession that would complement all the other evidence Marcus had gathered. David's arrogance had been his downfall. He'd assumed that I was just a confused widow who could be intimidated into silence. He had no idea that every word he'd spoken was being recorded, or that his threats were about to become evidence in a federal criminal case. The 24 hours he'd given me weren't for reconsidering my position. They were for finalizing the legal strategy that would destroy him and his family. Marcus had been right to be afraid of them, but he'd also been right to trust that I would be strong enough to fight back. Jennifer arrived at my house the next morning, looking nothing like the polished real estate agent I'd known for 3 years. Her usually perfect hair was disheveled, her makeup smeared, and her hands were shaking as she knocked on my door. When I opened it, she practically collapsed into my arms, sobbing. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." I helped her to the couch, genuinely alarmed by her appearance. This wasn't the confident, calculating woman that Marcus's investigation had revealed. This was someone who looked like she was having a complete breakdown. "Jennifer, what's wrong?" She looked up at me with red, swollen eyes. "David told me about your conversation yesterday, about the evidence you found about Marcus hiring a private investigator. Sarah, I can't do this anymore. I can't keep lying to you." I reached into my pocket and activated the recording device, though part of me felt guilty about it. Jennifer seemed genuinely distraught, but I'd learned not to trust appearances when it came to the Rodriguez family. "What lies, Jennifer?" She pulled out her phone and started scrolling through text messages. "Everything. The whole plan. The way we've been manipulating you. The things we said about you after Marcus died. I have it all here, messages between me and Mom and David about how to handle you." She handed me the phone, and I read through a thread of text messages that made my stomach turn. "Patricia, Sarah is getting suspicious about the finances. We need to speed up the timeline. David, I can handle Sarah. She's emotional and confused, easy to manipulate. Jennifer, what if she finds Marcus's records? What if she knows about the investigation? Patricia, then we discredit her. Grieving widow having mental breakdown. David has connections who can testify to her instability. David, or we could arrange an accident, make it look like grief-induced suicide." I stared at that last message, my hands shaking. They'd been discussing killing me. "Jennifer, when was this sent?" 2 weeks ago. Right after the memorial service. When you started asking questions about the house, she was crying harder now. "Sarah, I never wanted it to go this far. I never wanted anyone to get hurt. But you went along with it. I was scared. You don't know what it's like being in this family. Having Mom control everything, being dependent on money that wasn't really ours. I thought if I played along, maybe I could protect you somehow." I scrolled through more messages, finding evidence of their entire conspiracy laid out in digital detail, plans to forge my signature on property transfers, discussions about having me committed to a mental health facility, strategies for claiming that Marcus's marriage was invalid due to my supposed instability. "Jennifer, this shows that you've been planning to defraud me since the day Marcus died. I know, and I hate myself for it. But Sarah, you have to understand this family. We're not good people. We never have been. Mom raised us to believe that we were entitled to whatever we could take. That family loyalty meant covering for each other no matter what." She pulled tissues from her purse, trying to compose herself. "When Marcus started getting suspicious when he hired that investigator, Mom went into full panic mode. She said if Marcus exposed us, we'd all go to prison. She said we had to protect ourselves by stealing more money, by making sure that if something happened to Marcus, we'd have control of his assets before anyone could investigate. The life insurance policies, the property transfers, even the medical bills. It was all part of a plan to make you financially dependent on us." I thought about Patricia's sudden concern over Marcus's medical expenses, David's helpful delivery of bills I'd never seen. "You were trying to overwhelm me with debt so I'd have to accept your help." Exactly. If you were drowning in Marcus's medical bills and property expenses, you'd be grateful when we offered to help by taking over the financial management. Eventually, we'd have convinced you to sign everything over to us for your own protection. And if I refused, Jennifer's voice dropped to a whisper. "Mom has connections with doctors who would testify that grief had made you incompetent. David knows people who could create evidence of drug use or mental instability. They had a whole plan to have you declared unfit and committed." The scope of their conspiracy was breathtaking. They hadn't just been stealing from Marcus, they'd been planning to destroy me completely, to erase my existence from his life and claim everything he'd worked for. "Jennifer, why are you telling me this now?" "Because I can't live with it anymore." She grabbed my hands, her eyes desperate. "Because when I saw David's message about arranging an accident, I realized we'd crossed a line I can't come back from. Because Marcus was a good man who loved you, and he didn't deserve what we did to him. What you did to him? Jennifer's face crumpled. The hurricane, Sarah. Marcus dying in the hurricane, it wasn't just bad luck. My blood went cold. What do you mean? Marcus was supposed to evacuate with his unit on Sunday night. The original plan was for all non-essential personnel to leave before the storm hit. But Mom called his commanding officer and told them that Marcus had volunteered for extended rescue duty. That's not possible. Marcus volunteered because Mom convinced him that our elderly neighbor needed special help evacuating Mrs. Boudreau from next door to Mom's house. She called Marcus and said the old woman was refusing to leave, that she needed family to convince her. The room was spinning. Mrs. Boudreau has been dead for 2 years, Sarah. She died of cancer in 2003. Mom used her as an excuse to keep Marcus in the city during the hurricane. I couldn't breathe. Marcus had died because his mother had lied to him about a dead woman needing rescue. He'd died because Patricia had manipulated him into staying behind for a rescue mission that didn't exist. She wanted him to die in the hurricane. She wanted him to be in the city when the storm hit. Yes, if he died heroically during rescue operations, no one would question the family's immediate claims on his assets. The life insurance would pay out quickly. The hero narrative would prevent any investigation into our finances. And if he survived, then we'd continue the plan to discredit you and take control of his estate. Either way, Mom figured we'd end up with everything Marcus had built. I stared at Jennifer, trying to process the magnitude of what she was telling me. Patricia hadn't just stolen from Marcus for years. She'd orchestrated his death. She'd manipulated her own son into a situation where he was likely to die, all for money. Why didn't Marcus figure this out? Because he trusted Mom, because even when he suspected the financial fraud, he never imagined that his own mother would sacrifice his life for money. He died thinking he was saving an old woman, never knowing that Mom had sent him to die. Jennifer was sobbing again, and I felt like I was drowning in the horror of it all. My husband hadn't just died in Hurricane Katrina, he'd been murdered by his own family's greed. Jennifer, I need you to testify to all of this. I need you to tell the police, the FBI, everyone, what really happened. I will, she said, nodding frantically. I'll tell them everything about the fraud, the manipulation, the plan to hurt you. Even about Mom's role in Marcus's death. I can't live with this secret anymore. What about David and Patricia? What will they do when they find out you've talked to me? Jennifer's face went white. They'll try to stop me. They'll say I'm lying, that I'm having a breakdown, that I'm trying to blame them for my own crimes. And Sarah, ... She gripped my hands tighter. If they realize I'm going to testify against them, they might try to stop me permanently. Then we need to get you to safety and get this information to the authorities immediately. There's one more thing, Jennifer said, her voice barely audible. The reason I came here today, the reason I'm finally telling you the truth. What? David and Mom are planning something for tonight. They think they've given you enough time to come to your senses. And since you haven't, they're going to escalate. I don't know exactly what, but Mom mentioned something about making sure you can't cause any more trouble. The threat in David's 24-hour ultimatum suddenly became terrifyingly real. They weren't planning to wait for legal proceedings or property transfers. They were planning to eliminate me before I could expose them. We need to call the police right now, I said, reaching for my phone. Wait, Jennifer said, stopping me. There's something else, something I need to show you first. Evidence that will prove everything I've told you, but we have to get it before they realize I've betrayed them. What evidence? Mom keeps records of everything. Financial documents, recorded conversations, even notes about the hurricane plan. She's paranoid about having documentation in case anyone ever turns on the family, if we can get to her house. Before she destroys it all, we'll have proof of everything. I looked at Jennifer's desperate face, weighing the risks. This could be another trap, another manipulation designed to get me to a location where they could harm me. But it could also be the evidence I needed to prove that Marcus's death was more than just a hurricane tragedy. How do I know this isn't part of their plan? Jennifer pulled out her phone and showed me a new message from Patricia. Find out what Sarah knows and report back immediately. If she won't cooperate, we move to Plan B tonight. Plan B. I don't know exactly what it means, but, Sarah, I think they're planning to kill you, and I can't let that happen. Not after what they already did to Marcus. I didn't go to Patricia's house with Jennifer. Instead, I called Ray Broussard and told him everything Jennifer had revealed, including the text messages about Plan B and the truth about Marcus's death. Within an hour, my house was surrounded by FBI agents and New Orleans police detectives. Special Agent Maria Santos was a tall, serious woman in her 40s who specialized in financial crimes and family violence cases. She listened to Jennifer's confession with the practiced calm of someone who'd seen the worst of human nature, taking notes and asking pointed questions that revealed the scope of the conspiracy. Mrs. Rodriguez, Agent Santos said to Jennifer, "What you're describing constitutes multiple federal crimes. Identity theft, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and potentially murder itself. If we can prove your mother's role in Marcus's death." Jennifer nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know. I'm prepared to testify to everything, to turn over all the evidence I have access to. I just want this to stop." "And you believe your mother and brother are planning to harm Mrs. Sarah Rodriguez tonight?" "Yes." David's message about Plan B, Mom's escalating threats, the way they've been talking about eliminating the problem. "I think they're going to try to kill her and make it look like suicide." Agent Santos turned to me. "Mrs. Rodriguez, we're going to place you in protective custody immediately. We're also going to execute search warrants on Patricia and David Rodriguez's properties to secure evidence before they can destroy it." The next few hours were a blur of legal activity. Federal agents raided Patricia's house and David's apartment, while I was taken to a safe location downtown. Jennifer was placed in protective custody as well, since her cooperation had made her a target for retaliation. By evening, Agent Santos had returned with updates that exceeded my wildest expectations. "We found everything," she said, sitting across from me in the secure conference room. Patricia Rodriguez kept meticulous records of the entire operation, apparently as insurance against her own family members. "We have documented evidence of identity theft going back 7 years, financial fraud totaling over $400,000, and most importantly, recorded conversations about manipulating Marcus's evacuation orders." Recorded conversations? Your mother-in-law recorded her phone call with the Coast Guard commander, probably to make sure her story stayed consistent if anyone questioned it later. She has a recording of herself lying about the elderly neighbor, convincing the commander that Marcus had volunteered for extended rescue duty. The weight of that revelation hit me like a physical blow. Patricia had recorded herself orchestrating Marcus's death, had kept it like a trophy of her successful manipulation. "There's more," Agent Santos continued. "We found evidence that Patricia had been researching hurricane patterns and Coast Guard rescue protocols for months before Katrina hit. She knew the storm was going to be catastrophic, knew that rescue personnel would be in extreme danger, and she deliberately kept Marcus in harm's way. That's premeditated murder. That's exactly what it is." We also found her contingency plans for after Marcus's death, forged documents prepared in advance, fake power of attorney papers, even a draft will that would have left everything to her instead of you. Agent Santos spread out photographs of documents seized from Patricia's house, bank records, insurance applications, legal papers, all the evidence of systematic fraud that Marcus had been investigating before his death. David's apartment was equally revealing. We found drug trafficking records, weapons, and detailed plans for your ... elimination, including surveillance photos of your house, your daily routine, and discussions with known criminals about making your death look accidental. I stared at the photos of my own house, taken from various angles, with notes about my schedule and habits. They'd been watching me for weeks, planning exactly how to kill me. What happens now? Now we arrest them. Patricia Rodriguez is being charged with conspiracy to commit murder, first-degree murder in Marcus's death, identity theft, wire fraud, and about a dozen other federal crimes. David Rodriguez faces similar charges plus drug trafficking and conspiracy to commit murder in your case. If convicted on all charges, they're both looking at life in prison without parole. And Jennifer's cooperation has been invaluable. She faced charges for her role in the financial fraud, but will recommend reduced sentencing in exchange for her testimony. Probably 5 to 7 years instead of the 22 life her family is facing. Agent Santos leaned back in her chair. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I want you to understand something. Your husband was building an incredibly strong case against his family. If he'd lived to present this evidence, they would have been imprisoned years ago. In a very real sense, completing his investigation has not only prevented them from committing more crimes against other victims." That evening, I watched the news coverage of Patricia and David's arrests from the safety of the FBI safe house. The story had made national headlines. Hurricane Katrina, hero's mother charged with his murder. The details were shocking enough to capture media attention across the country. Patricia was arrested at her house in the French Quarter, the house that Marcus had bought for her with money she'd been stealing from him. The news cameras captured her being led away in handcuffs, her face a mask of rage and defiance. She showed no remorse, no acknowledgement of the pain she'd caused, only fury at being caught. David was arrested at a known drug house in the Bywater, where he'd been hiding since learning about Jennifer's cooperation. Loaded weapon and detailed plans for my murder, including maps of my neighborhood and a timeline for the planned attack. But it was Patricia's arrest that provided the most dramatic footage. As she was being placed in the police car, she looked directly at the news camera and said, "That little bitch destroyed my family. She got what she deserved." Even in custody, facing murder charges, Patricia couldn't see me as anything other than an obstacle to her greed. The financial recovery process was swift once the criminal charges were filed. Federal agents froze all accounts connected to the fraud and began the process of returning stolen assets to Marcus's estate. The rental properties, the forged loans, even Patricia's house. Everything was seized as evidence and prepared for restitution. By the end of the week, I'd recovered over $350,000 in stolen assets, plus the 4 rental properties that generated monthly income. The financial security that Marcus had tried to build for our future was finally mine, free from his family's manipulation, but more importantly, the truth about Marcus's death was finally public. He wasn't just a hurricane victim, he was a murder victim whose heroism had been exploited by the people who should have protected him. The Coast Guard held a special ceremony honoring his memory and acknowledging the circumstances of his death. Ray Broussard visited me during my final day in protective custody. "Your husband would be proud of you," he said. "He spent his last months building this case because he knew you'd need protection, he knew his family would try to destroy you, and he made sure you'd have the tools to fight back. I just wish he'd been able to see them brought to justice himself." "He did see it," Ray said. "Every piece of evidence he gathered, every recording he made, every document he saved, that was him fighting for justice." I thought about Marcus's final voicemail, his promise that I was stronger than I knew. He'd been right. He'd given me everything I needed to win a war I hadn't even known. I was fighting Patricia, and David Rodriguez had underestimated me completely. They'd seen a grieving widow and assumed I'd be easy to manipulate and control. They'd never imagined that Marcus had prepared me for this battle, had given me the weapons I'd need to expose their crimes and reclaim everything they'd stolen. But their biggest mistake was thinking that Marcus's death would end his investigation. Instead, it had only ensured that the truth would eventually come to light. The headline read, "Hurricane Widow Exposes Family's $1 Million Fraud Scheme." Legally mind reading about my own life like it was someone else's nightmare. The journalist had done thorough research, interviewing FBI agents, legal experts, and even some of Marcus's Coast Guard colleagues who remembered the suspicious circumstances around his final deployment. The case represents one of the most elaborate family fraud schemes in Louisiana history. The article quoted Agent Santos as saying, "The defendants systematically exploited their relationship with the victim for years, culminating in what we believe was the deliberate orchestration of his death during Hurricane Katrina." The public reaction was swift and overwhelming. My phone rang constantly with calls from reporters, victims' rights advocates, and people who'd had similar experiences with family financial abuse. The story had struck a nerve apparently. Family exploitation was more common than anyone wanted to admit, but it was the community response that surprised me most. Marcus's Coast Guard colleagues organized a fundraiser to establish a foundation in his memory, to express their outrage at what Patricia and David had done. "That woman deserves to rot in prison," said Mrs. Chen, my elderly neighbor who'd been bringing me casserole since Marcus died. "Using her own son's death for money, it's evil, pure evil." The legal proceedings moved quickly. Patricia and David were denied bail due to flight risk and the severity of the charges. Jennifer was released on her own recognizance after agreeing to full cooperation with prosecutors. The trial date was set for March, but the evidence was so overwhelming that legal experts predicted plea bargains. Patricia's own recordings had provided prosecutors with an airtight case for premeditated murder, and David's detailed plans for my assassination left no room for reasonable doubt about his intentions. 3 weeks after the arrests, I received an unexpected visitor. Captain Morrison from Marcus's Coast Guard unit came to my house with a manila envelope and a solemn expression. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I wanted to personally deliver this to you," he said, handing me the envelope. "It's Marcus's posthumous commendation for heroism during Hurricane Katrina." The Coast Guard investigated the circumstances of his final mission after learning about his mother's deception. The envelope was a beautiful certificate and medal honoring Marcus's sacrifice. Morrison continued, "The Coast Guard is implementing new protocols for emergency deployments to prevent no service member will ever again be placed in danger. Based solely on family requests without independent verification." I held Marcus's medal, thinking about how he died, believing he was saving an elderly woman who was already dead. His heroism had been real, even if the mission had been a lie. And now his death would help protect other service members from similar manipulation. The media attention continued for weeks. I was invited to appear on national news programs to discuss family financial abuse and the warning signs of financial exploitation. It was terrifying at first. I'd never wanted to be a public figure, but I realized that people to learn from my experience. "I want people to understand that family love doesn't mean accepting abuse," I said, looking directly into the camera. Marcus's family claimed to love him while stealing from him, manipulating him, and ultimately, causing his death? Real love doesn't exploit, and real love doesn't sacrifice someone's life for money. The interviewer nodded. What would you say to someone who suspects their family is financially exploiting them? Document everything. Trust your instincts, and don't let anyone make you feel guilty for protecting yourself. Marcus tried to handle this situation quietly because he loved his family and wanted to protect them from consequences. But their crimes escalated because they faced no accountability. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop enabling destructive behavior. Family members' lifestyles. Spouses who discovered years of hidden financial betrayal. The response was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Heartbreaking because so many people had suffered similar exploitation, but inspiring because Marcus's story was helping others find the courage to seek help and protection. 6 weeks after the arrests, Patricia's defense attorney contacted my lawyer about a potential plea agreement. Absolutely not, I told my attorney, Rebecca Tran. She orchestrated my husband's murder and planned to kill me. She deserves life in prison. The prosecutor agrees with you, Rebecca said. They're confident they can get a conviction on the murder charges, so they're not interested in deals that don't include life sentences. David's situation was similar. His attorney had approached prosecutors about pleading guilty to the financial crimes in exchange for dropping the attempted murder charges, but the evidence of his plans to kill me was too strong to ignore. Both defendants are going to trial, Rebecca informed me. They're hoping that sympathy for Patricia as an elderly mother will influence the jury, but Agent Santos thinks that strategy will backfire. Juries don't usually sympathize with people who murder their own children for money. The preliminary hearings were scheduled for January, and I was required to testify about discovering the evidence and the threats I'd received. It would be the first time I'd seen Patricia and David since their arrests, and I wasn't sure how I'd handle facing them in court, but I also knew that Marcus had given me everything I needed to be strong. His evidence, his planning, that family loyalty would protect them from consequences, that their crimes would remain hidden forever. They'd underestimated the power of truth, the strength of documentation, and the determination of a widow who refused to be victimized. Now the whole world knew what they'd done. Their reputations were destroyed, their freedom was gone, and their crimes were a matter of public record. The family that had hidden behind respectability and community standing was exposed as a criminal conspiracy that had murdered one of their own for money. Marcus's heroism was finally getting the recognition it deserved, and his killers were facing justice. It wasn't the ending he would have chosen, but it was the justice he'd died trying to achieve. 6 months after Patricia and David's convictions, life without parole for first-degree murder and conspiracy stood in the beautifully restored community center that would house the Marcus Rodriguez Foundation for Hurricane Victims and Family Financial Abuse Prevention. The renovations had been funded entirely by the recovered stolen assets. Patricia's house in the French Quarter had sold for over $800,000. David's seized drug money had totaled another $150,000, and the rental properties were generating steady income that would fund the foundation's work for years to come. But more than the money, I'd found a sense of purpose that I'd never expected. Working with other victims of family financial abuse had shown me that Marcus's story wasn't unique, was part of a pattern of exploitation that happened in families across every economic and social level. Sarah, the grief counseling group, is ready to start, said Dr. Angela Reyes, the Foundation's Director of Victim Services. She was a psychologist who specialized in family trauma, and she'd become both a colleague and a friend over the past months. The Foundation offered multiple services: legal assistance for victims of family financial abuse, emergency shelter for people fleeing exploitative family situations, and support groups for those healing from betrayal by people they'd trusted most. But the service I was most proud of was our grief counseling program for people whose mourning had been complicated by family manipulation. Remember, healthy grief looks different for everyone. I told the circle of 8 people who'd gathered in our comfortable meeting room, what it doesn't look like is other people telling you how long to mourn, or trying to use your pain to manipulate you into decisions that benefit them. Maria, a 34-year-old teacher whose in-laws had tried to claim her husband's life insurance after his car accident, nodded emphatically. They kept telling me that keeping his wedding ring was unhealthy attachment. Now I realize they just wanted me to give up anything valuable. Grief isn't pathological, I continued. It's love with nowhere to go. The pathological part is when other people try to exploit that love for their own gain. After the group session, I walked through the Foundation's offices, checking on the various programs we'd established. The legal clinic had helped recover over $2 million in stolen assets for victims in just 6 months. The emergency shelter had provided safe housing for 37 people fleeing financial abuse, and our educational programs had reached thousands of people through workshops and online resources, but it was the letters that meant the most to me. Every week I received messages from people who'd seen my story in the media and found the courage to investigate their own family's financial behavior. Many had discovered exploitation similar to what Marcus had endured. Others had simply learned to recognize warning signs and protect themselves from future abuse. One letter had particularly moved me. My brother was stealing from our father's accounts while Dad was in hospice care. I might never have investigated if I hadn't seen your interview about family financial abuse. Thanks to your foundation's legal referrals, we recovered $60,000 and my brother is now facing criminal charges. Dad died knowing that justice would be served. That evening, I attended the monthly Coast Guard memorial service, where Marcus's name was now permanently engraved on the Hurricane Katrina Heroes Memorial. Captain Morrison had become a friend and supporter of the foundation, often speaking at our events about the unique vulnerabilities that military families faced from financial predators. Marcus's legacy isn't just about exposing family fraud, he said during his remarks. It's about changing how we think about family loyalty. True loyalty means protecting each other from harm, not covering up harmful behavior. It means holding each other accountable, not enabling destructive choices. After the service, I drove to the cemetery where we'd finally been able to hold a proper burial for Marcus. His body had never been recovered from the Hurricane Katrina wreckage. Wearing his grandmother's engagement ring and carrying the latest foundation newsletter that detailed all the lives we'd helped in his memory. "Hey, baby," I said quietly, placing fresh flowers on his grave. The foundation helped another family this week, a mother whose adult children were forging her signature on reverse mortgage documents. She's 78 years old, Marcus, and they were trying to steal her house while she was dealing with cancer treatment. A gentle breeze stirred the oak trees around the cemetery, and I took it as Marcus encouraging me to continue. We got her house back and her children are facing charges. She reminded me of so trusting, so generous, so unable to believe that family could be capable of such cruelty. But unlike you, she had somewhere to turn for help. I'd been going to therapy regularly since the trial ended, working through the complex trauma of losing Marcus, discovering his family's betrayal, and surviving their attempts to destroy me. Dr. Reyes had helped me understand that my grief was complicated not just by loss, but by the revelation that our entire marriage had been lived under threat from people we'd trusted. The hardest part wasn't losing you, I continued, speaking to Marcus's headstone. The hardest part was learning that while we were building a life together, your family was planning to take it all away. But the foundation work is helping me heal from that betrayal. Every person we help, every family we protect, it feels like we're winning against the people who tried to destroy us. The sun was setting over New Orleans, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded me of the evening Marcus and I had gotten engaged. We'd been sitting on our front porch talking about our future, making plans for the family we wanted to build together. Those plans had been stolen by Hurricane Katrina and Patricia's greed, but in a strange way, the foundation was giving me a different kind of family, a community of survivors who understood betrayal and loss, who were committed to protecting others from similar experiences. Jennifer had been released from prison after serving 18 months, and she'd become an unexpected ally in the foundation's work. Her insider knowledge of how family financial abuse operated had helped us develop better protection strategies and educational materials. I know some people think I'm crazy for working with her, I told Marcus. But she was a victim too, in her own way. Patricia manipulated all of you from childhood, taught you that family meant taking whatever you could get away with. Jennifer was the only one who found the courage to break free from that pattern. The foundation's work had also connected me with lawmakers interested in strengthening protections against family financial abuse. We were working on legislation that would require additional safeguards for elderly victims and create specialized courts for handling family exploitation cases. Your death exposed a system that fails to protect people from their own families, I said. But we're changing that system, one case at a time, one law at a time, one survivor at a time. As I prepared to leave the cemetery, I felt a sense of peace that had been missing since Marcus died. The grief would always be with me, but it was no longer the consuming darkness it had been in those first months. It had transformed into something productive, something healing, something that honored both Marcus's memory and the love we'd shared. The Rodriguez family had tried to erase me from Marcus's legacy, to claim his sacrifice for their own benefit while destroying everything we'd built together. Instead, their crimes had revealed the scope of family financial abuse and inspired a movement to protect other victims. Marcus's heroism during Hurricane Katrina had saved lives, but his final investigation, the evidence he'd gathered and the protection he'd provided for me, was saving lives, too, in a different but equally important way. 2 years after Marcus's death, I stood in front of a mirror in my bedroom, adjusting the delicate silver ring I now wore on my right hand. It wasn't an engagement ring or a wedding band. It was something entirely different. Something that represented my journey from victim to survivor, from grief to purpose, from isolation to community. I'd had it custom made by a local jeweler, incorporating elements from Marcus's grandmother's engagement ring with new designs that symbolized growth and resilience. The center stone was the original diamond, but it was now surrounded by small sapphires arranged in a pattern that resembled both a hurricane's eye and a compass. Rose representing the storm I'd survived and the direction I'd found. Today marked exactly 2 years since Hurricane Katrina had taken Marcus's life, and it was also the day I'd chosen to share my complete story publicly for the first time. The foundation was hosting a major fundraising event, and I'd been asked to give the keynote address about surviving family betrayal and finding purpose in pain. The venue was the same church where Marcus's memorial service had been held, but today it was filled with supporters, survivors, and advocates who understood that family exploitation was a serious crime requiring serious consequences. The contrast with that horrible day when Patricia had attacked my grief couldn't have been more stark. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, looking out at the packed sanctuary. 2 years ago, I thought I knew what family meant. I thought it meant unconditional love, mutual support, and shared sacrifice for each other's well-being. I learned in the most painful way possible that for some people, family is just an opportunity for exploitation. I told them about Marcus's investigation, about discovering the scope of his family's betrayal, about the evidence he'd left to protect me. I spoke about the legal battle, the threats against my life, and the justice that had finally been served. But most importantly, I talked about what I'd learned in the 2 years since, that healing from family betrayal was possible, that victims could reclaim their power, and that surviving trauma could become a source of strength for helping others. The Marcus Rodriguez Foundation has now helped over 300 families recover from financial abuse, I continued. We've assisted in the recovery of over $8 million in stolen assets. We've provided emergency shelter for 150 people fleeing exploitative family situations, and we've educated thousands of people about the warning signs of family financial abuse. The audience applauded, but I held up my hand to continue. Those numbers are important, but they don't tell the whole story. The real success of this foundation isn't measured in dollars recovered or charges filed. It's measured in the moment. When a victim realizes they're not alone, when they understand that family love doesn't require accepting abuse, when they find the courage to say no to exploitation. After my speech, I was approached by dozens of people sharing their own stories of family betrayal and recovery. An elderly man whose daughter had stolen his retirement savings, a young woman whose siblings had manipulated her into funding their lifestyle while she struggled to pay for college, a veteran whose family had exploited his PTSD to gain control of his disability benefits. Each story was different, but the pattern was always the same. Trusted family members exploiting love and loyalty for personal gain. Victims struggling with the dual trauma of financial loss and emotional betrayal, and the long journey toward healing and justice. What gives me hope, I told Dr. Reyes as we cleaned up after the event, is that people are talking about this now. When Marcus first discovered what his family was doing, he had nowhere to turn. No resources specifically designed for family financial abuse. Now we have legal protections, support services, and a growing understanding that this is a serious crime, not just a family matter. That evening, I attended the annual Coast Guard Heroes Dinner, where Marcus was being honored with a special commendation for service members who died in the line of duty due to family manipulation. The Marcus Rodriguez recognition would be given annually to investigations that exposed exploitation of military personnel by their own families. Captain Morrison presented the award to me on Marcus's behalf. Petty Officer Rodriguez died believing he was saving lives, he said. What he couldn't have known was that his own investigation and the evidence he gathered would ultimately save many more lives by exposing patterns of family abuse that had gone unrecognized for too long. As I accepted the heavy glass award engraved with Marcus's name and service record, I thought about the voicemail he'd left me before his final mission. You're stronger than you know, and you're going to need that strength. He'd been right. I had needed that strength to survive his death, to uncover his family's crimes, to fight for justice, and to build something meaningful from the wreckage of our stolen future. But I'd discovered something Marcus might not have anticipated. The strength he'd believed I possessed had grown exponentially through the process of helping others. Every victim we assisted, every family we reunited with stolen assets, every person who found the courage to report abuse, they all contributed to my own healing. Later that night, I sat in the renovated home office where Marcus had once kept his secret investigation files. The room was now the Foundation's after-hours workspace, filled with case files and legal documents related to our ongoing efforts to help families recover from exploitation. On the desk was a framed photo of Marcus in his Coast Guard uniform, but also photos of some of the families we'd helped. The elderly woman who'd recovered her house from fraudulent reverse mortgage schemes, the disabled veteran who'd regained control of his benefits from exploitative relatives, the young mother who'd escaped her family's financial manipulation with her children's college funds intact. I opened my laptop and began working on my next project, a comprehensive guide to recognizing and preventing family financial abuse. The book would include legal resources, emotional support strategies, and most importantly, stories from survivors who'd reclaimed their lives and finances from exploitative family members. The manuscript was dedicated to Marcus, but it was really for everyone who'd ever trusted the wrong people simply because they shared DNA or marriage vows. Family was supposed to be a source of strength and protection, but for too many people, it had become a source of exploitation and harm. The most important thing to understand about family financial abuse, I wrote in the introduction, is that it's not about the money. It's about power, control, and the violation of trust. Recovery isn't just about reclaiming stolen assets, it's about reclaiming your right to safety, dignity, and authentic relationships. As I worked, I occasionally touched the ring on my right hand, my symbol of survival and transformation. Marcus's family had tried to reduce me to nothing more than an obstacle to their greed. They'd attempted to steal not just his money, but my identity, my future, and ultimately my life. Instead, their crimes had revealed a hidden epidemic of family exploitation and inspired a movement to protect vulnerable people from the very relatives who should have been protecting them. Marcus's death had been a tragedy, but his legacy was becoming a beacon of hope for people trapped in similar situations. I finished writing as the sun began to rise over New Orleans, painting the sky in soft pastels that reminded me of new beginnings. In a few hours, I'd be back at the Foundation, meeting with lawyers, counselors, and advocates who shared our mission of protecting families from exploitation. But right now, in the quiet morning light, I allowed myself to feel proud of what we'd accomplished. Marcus's investigation had exposed his family's crimes, but it had also exposed something larger: the need for systemic change in how society addresses family financial abuse. We'd built that change one case at a time, one survivor at a time, one family at a time. And we'd done it in memory of a man who died trying to protect his wife from the very people who should have loved and protected him. The Rodriguez family had underestimated Marcus's intelligence, his determination, and his love for me. They'd thought his death would end his investigation and give them permanent access to everything he'd worked for. They'd been wrong about everything. Marcus's love had been stronger than their greed, his evidence more compelling than their lies, and his legacy more enduring than their crimes. And I'd been stronger than any of us had known, strong enough to honor his memory by fighting for justice, strong enough to transform our tragedy into hope for others, and strong enough to build a new life dedicated to protecting people from the kind of betrayal we'd endured. Marcus had saved lives during Hurricane Katrina, but his final investigation had saved lives too. And through the Foundation's work, he was still saving lives, including, in many ways, my own. That was the real victory. Not just exposing the people who'd betrayed us, but creating something beautiful and meaningful from the worst thing that had ever happened to me. Marcus would have been proud of what we'd built together, even though he wasn't here to see it. But in a way, he was here in every family we helped, every victim we empowered, every moment when love proved stronger than greed. His heroism lived on, not just in the people he'd rescued from hurricane floodwaters, but in the people we continued to rescue from family exploitation, and that legacy would endure long after Patricia and David Rodriguez were forgotten in their prison cells, long after their crimes became cautionary tales, long after the pain of their betrayal had transformed completely into the power to help others heal.